Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I support Amendment 2 that was inserted in the other place, and I hope we're going to be able to vote on the amendments that members have tabled. And I also hope the government will finally honour the promises to leaseholders which they've been making for the past 3 years, and this bill is an opportunity to do that. I want to draw the attention of the House to a problem facing hundreds of my constituents living in flats recently built by Barrett's at Waterside Park alongside the Thames and Upton Gardens on the site of the Boleyn ground where West Ham used to play. Freeholds have since been brought from Barrett's by Aviva. The landlord agent is Mainstay. Their property manager is First Port. The buildings in both developments have a B1 EWS1 certificate. There is combustible material in the walling, but the risk isn't sufficient to warrant requiring its replacement. The combustible material is in a vapour layer within the structure. That is material still being used in buildings being built now. There's been no suggestion that builders should stop using it. Leaseholders in the development have had no problems given the B1 certification in obtaining a mortgage. These buildings clearly do not meet the criteria for the government's cladding funds. Nevertheless, the property managers made an application for funding to replace this combustible vapour layer. In the case of Upton Gardens, the application has been refused. In the case of Waterside Park, the decision is still awaited, but presumably that will be refused as well. But the property managers appear poised to embark on replacing this combustible material at an estimated cost of £30,000 per flat, which they will charge to the leaseholders. They've appointed contractors, they've paid for preliminary work already, although work hasn't yet begun in earnest. The materials to be replaced are being used in buildings being built at the moment. There's no requirement to replace it. The residents don't want to fund its replacement. So why is replacement poised to go ahead? The only motivation the leaseholders have been able to identify is to provide fee income for the managers. Will the Minister state clearly today that buildings with B1 certification should not be remediated without agreement of the leaseholders? The Minister at the start of the debate made the point that 95% of high-rise buildings with unsafe ACM cladding have either been remediated or there are workers on site doing the job. Can the Minister, winding up, tell us the actual figures? How many buildings have been remediated? How many buildings have workers now on site? With constituents, we'd be very interested to hear those numbers. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Video link. Brendan Clarke-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And this is a short but critical bill, which is why I agree that the amendments brought to this House, whilst well intended, would once again be inappropriate for this bill and would instead require the drafting of primary legislation to make them workable legally. And to make things worse, if these amendments were to be added to this bill, then both the government and the taxpayer could be exposed to action by the owners of these buildings. And this is something that must be avoided, and therefore this bill must be watertight. And it would be quite wrong if we were having to withdraw the fire safety bill because of this. Those undertaking inspections and assessments need clarity, and the key to this is to keep the bill short. It would also be wrong to potentially delay the implementation of the judge's recommendations from the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry, which this would also cause potentially. Legal advice must be accepted and forms the basis for making good on our promises, as does the input of independent experts. Decisive action must also be taken, and the extra £3.5 billion committed by the government, bringing total funding to £5 billion, is to be welcomed. And this has culminated in a commitment to fully fund the replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in residential buildings 18 metres and higher. And whilst this is not the case for buildings between 11 and 18 metres, the new scheme will protect against unaffordable costs and limit these to £50 per month towards remediations. This also gives reassurance to banks and mortgage lenders. The new developer levy will ensure developers also make a contribution, and Gateway 2 should raise an extra £2 billion towards this. As has been stated before, it is the Building Safety Bill which will provide a new era of accountability for managing risk with the construction of these buildings. There will be tougher sanctions for those who fail to meet their obligations, and a guarantee that it is they, not the taxpayer or leaseholders, who will remedy this. And this bill will also ensure there is more transparency concerning the costs related to maintaining a safe building, such as in the annual service charge. And it is right that reasonable limits are placed on these charges and that leaseholders are protected from large-scale remediation costs. The Association of British Insurers have also backed this government stance, as has Dame Judith Hackett, the government's independent advisor on building safety. In conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the replacement of unsafe cladding and other remedial works is an issue that must be taken seriously. The Fire Safety Bill alone cannot remedy this. Hence, why these well-intentioned amendments would not be appropriate, the wider approach must be considered and indeed welcomed. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Video link. Rachael Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Nearly 4 years after the terrible Grenfell disaster, it's shameful that people are still living in unsafe buildings. Over 50% of blocks identified as having unsafe cladding have either not started or not completed remediation, and this is causing sleepless nights for many across the country, as well as deep anxiety over the threat of huge financial costs. The government's failed to step in to protect leaseholders, and while the Minister states that these issues should be dealt with as part of another piece of legislation, this simply comes across to the public as an excuse to kick these issues further down the road. And as other members have already said, they are affecting our constituents now and should be tackled now. So I speak in support of the amendments in the name of the Leader of the Opposition and my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, and the members for Stevenage and Southampton Itchen. While the government announced additional funding for cladding remediation on the 10th of February, leaseholders living in buildings under 18 metres will still have to cover some cladding-related costs. And the fund fails to cover huge costs of rectifying other fire safety defects and the necessary interim safety measures. According to UK Cladding Action Group, the average total cost of building remediation for both cladding and other fire safety defects is £49,000. And the group forecasts that 33% of affected flat owners earn £35,000 a year or less. These people can't afford to cover the cost of high interim safety measures or excessive insurance premiums, the government's piecemeal loan scheme for buildings under 18 metres with cladding, or the huge cost of remediating other fire safety defects. Luton South constituents have told me how living with the threats to their safety and facing exorbitant remediation costs have severely impacted their mental health. Some are on the brink of bankruptcy as they're unable to cover the costs or sell their homes. And this is an issue across the country, as 17% of respondents to an Inside Housing survey stated they are exploring bankruptcy. Let's be clear about who we're talking about here. The people affected by this are our social workers, our teachers, our nurses, other key workers in our communities. Many are first-time buyers. It's unjust to leave leaseholders to bear the costs. Leaseholders bought their properties in good faith, unaware of the failures of the regulatory system. The government must deliver on its promise to keep the public safe by urgently remediating the remaining unsafe buildings, ensuring leaseholders do not have to foot the bill, and implementing the recommendations from Phase 1 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry.
Mr. Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. For many, all they seek is certainty, an assurance that they will not be faced with unaffordable costs, or the confidence that they are not trapped in a home they cannot sell. The government has worked hard to deliver this. There has been clear action to make the most unsafe buildings secure, fully funding the replacement of cladding from those buildings deemed to be independent expert assessment as the highest risk, with no cost ultimately to the leaseholders, which is what we're discussing today.
Thank you very much. We've talked a lot about taxpayers' money in this debate, but I think the right honourable gentleman might agree with me that it's also right that the government works with the industry, with the construction sector, with financial services providers, and also with the insurance industry to find ways of making sure that these different sectors in the private sector can also contribute.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. In my previous life before coming to this place, I worked as an insurance broker, so I do know a thing or two about the insurance industry. One of those things that came up for those properties most likely to flood was the flood re-scheme. So I would urge ministers, both with the Treasury and my honourable friend on the front bench, to see what they can be doing with the insurance sector to bring in a similar scheme for those businesses, for those properties affected. It is right so far that public money has been committed to those buildings that are most at risk. And as has been discussed many times already in this debate, those over 18 metres are 4 times at risk than any other property. So it is right we are tackling with those to begin with. I know there are calls for more money to be made available, but there is a balance to be struck and accommodations to be made. And as has been said already in this debate, public finances are finite, and we cannot be putting on a further tax bombshell at this time for those who are struggling across the country, not just the leaseholders. There is no such thing as government money, it is taxpayers' money, so we do need to find that right balance. And I think so far what we have done is find the middle road. Yes, we can be doing more, and the building safety bill that's been discussed previously will be a good avenue to address some of these further concerns, as may well be the budget next week. So it's right to be contemplating these things in a broader spectrum rather than just making a knee-jerk reaction in this bill today. We all have a responsibility, Mr Deputy Speaker, to strike a fair settlement, to balance concerns and to find a way to ensure that safety and security is the #1 priority for people who have been affected by this scandal. We also have a duty to consider, particularly in a difficult economic environment, the spending of taxpayers' money, to consider that many taxpayers are not homeowners and whether it is fair to ask them to step in. We must remember why the government introduced this bill in the first place and why the scope of this bill is so focused and specific in what it's designed to achieve. The focus of this legislation is, as ought to be clear, safety. Ensuring that those responsible for fire safety, for the safety of those living in their building, know their duties and are held to those duties. Leaseholders, building owners and the taxpayer deserve a solid legislative base with clarity through which remediate. I'll give way to the honourable friend.
Listened carefully to what you've said, and you mentioned the taxpayer several times. Now, I said in my opening remarks, and so did the honourable member for Stevenage, that our amendment was not to put any burden on the taxpayer. If it's a taxpayer you're worried about, as am I, and we say that the taxpayer won't be responsible, which is what we're saying, we therefore say that we should protect all the leaseholders.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I think, unfortunately, there can't be a guarantee. For a lot of these developers where they may no longer exist, insurance schemes are no longer applicable, there will be gaps within this, and we do have to be responsible. So whilst I think this amendment is very well intentioned and I am incredibly sympathetic towards it, I think there are gaps in that amendment, and that is why, unfortunately, I will not be able to join in the lobby today, although I do very much applaud the sentiment of your amendment and the work that you have put in towards that. As I was saying, Mr Deputy Speaker, leaseholders, building owners and taxpayers deserve a solid legislative base. That is what we are trying to do today by making sure that our properties, our leaseholders are safe, and that is why we do need to focus on those which are most likely to be affected. I don't want to see the implementation of this bill frustrated. It's already taken far too long to get to this point, so we do need to make sure that we can proceed. As has been said many times, and including from my honourable friend and from the front bench, we have a duty now. Do we get this right, or do we do it quick? And from my own perspective, Mr Deputy Speaker, we need to get it right. There are far too many people who have fallen through gaps, who are struggling, who are unable to afford it. So it is right that we take a fully reasoned approach, speaking to experts, speaking to all trade bodies, to make sure that we get this right. And that is what I urge the front bench, ministers, the Treasury, and everyone else to continue to do so. So whilst I want to finish by thanking all members for bringing forward some of these amendments, like I said, they don't quite deal with the bill at hand, and that is why I will not be able to support them and will be back in the government today, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Link. Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm speaking today in utter frustration, having heard many of the comments so far in the debate today, and to speak in support of the amendments tabled by the opposition and by the honourable members for Stevenage and Southampton and Itchen, and on behalf of hundreds of thousands of leaseholders in Putney, Roehampton and Southfields who are staring down the barrel of this scandal, and with thanks to the cladding action campaigners across the country. I welcome this bill, but it is too small and too slow. There's frustration across the House of Commons today. We can do this right and do it faster, and we must. Today, we had another statement of support for leaseholders from the Minister, who said he agrees with the intent to give leaseholders peace of mind and financial certainty. And yet the government didn't write this into the bill and isn't supporting the amendments. No leaseholders of buildings of any height should be made to foot a bill of thousands of pounds that they cannot afford. At the sharp end of the failings of this bill are millions of leaseholders trapped in unsafe homes who are suffering enormous stress, anxiety and emotional anguish, and who feel totally abandoned. And I have met many of them in my constituency. Their lives are on pause and might be for years. This is what some people have told me. As every day, week or month goes by, our financial liability and stability becomes ever more disturbing and deeply troubling. When will it end? And another, who bought her flat using money inherited from her mother's passing, said to me, despite my emotional attachment to my flat, current circumstances make me almost wish I'd never bought it. It's a burden and a hindrance to me moving forward with the next stage of my life at a prime time when I want to start a family. Another resident is a victim of domestic violence, been trying to sell her property to raise money for legal fees, and has had to receive food parcels due to lost income during the pandemic. And her insurance premiums have now increased by 500%. Under no circumstances should leaseholders, regardless of the height of their building, have to pay for cladding remediation costs that are the fault of developers and a failed regulatory system. Funding should be based on fire risk, not height. It should have upfront costs and not loans for all leaseholders, and it should include other fire safety issues. These are up to £100,000 in charges for some Putney leaseholders. At the current pace of spend, the Building Safety Fund, which has only approved 12 applications, will only approve all the applications, the 532 applications, by 2031. The pace of change is far too slow. So I urge colleagues from both sides of the House, please do the right thing today, back the British people and make sure leaseholders don't pay.
Thank you, Lady Link. Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. One of the lessons from the Grenfell tragedy was that a number of companies in the construction sector had been recklessly gaming the system, resulting in unsafe materials being used. But crucially, construction and post-occupancy inspections did not pick up these risks. As someone who worked in oil and gas and then in construction over several years, I can see the very different approach taken by these two sectors. Many of our constituents who live in leasehold flats face significant costs, such as waking watch costs and several other fire risk liabilities not related to cladding. The new 30 million Wake and Watch Relief Fund and the £1.6 billion remediation funding and the commitment to recruit hundreds of specialist risk assessors and specialist workers show this government is committed to resolving the problem and in supporting people stranded in their property through no fault of their own. But I would like to raise issues brought to me by a constituent. At present, buildings over 18 metres will have all cladding remedial work paid for by the government. Those between 11 to 18 metres will be offered alone, with residents in buildings below 11 metres receiving no financial support at all, the latter being the situation my constituent's daughter finds herself in. While it is right to target remediation first to highest risk buildings, there is a question of fairness as to who pays if you happen to have purchased a building that is not as tall. In addition to the removal of cladding, inspections have highlighted further building faults such as the missing fire breaks, wooden balconies and combustible insulation. The repair costs alone could be in excess of £25,000 per flat. There is no provision for support with these repairs that will be required before a fire safety certificate can be issued, allowing them to eventually sell their home. They would not have been privy to these liabilities, as the conveyancing process would not have highlighted the possibility of these risks existing at point of purchase. Risk awareness at the conveyancing stage is something I had raised in my 10-minute rule bill. Fire safety officers should not only be competent by the certifications they hold, but they should be present and responsible for sign-off on-site at all key stages. Whilst the amendments presented before us today are made with good intentions, we cannot delay this bill any longer. Hopefully, construction and occupancy model for fire safety, much as gas and electrical checks are carried out, to pick up on changes to the fabric of a building that could be made over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. We lost your video early on, but we could hear you perfectly. Video link. Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome this bill, but nearly 4 years after the Grenfell disaster, and despite assurances by this government, hundreds of thousands of people are still living with the fear that they could be next. And it's a scandal that this first and only piece of primary legislation that this Tory government has brought forward on fire safety to prevent such a disaster ever happening again. In Liverpool, 10% of buildings are still covered in highly flammable cladding, and with a further 5% covered in fire-retarding cladding. And Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service has suffered 35% cuts to funding since 2010 and lost 1/3 of its firefighters during this time. Austerity, coupled with rollbacks and safety regulations, have combined to make a perfect storm. Time and again, we've heard promise after promise that the recommendations of the first phase of the Grenfell Tower inquiry will be fully implemented. Yet this bill does not include a single recommendation from the inquiry's first phase. Does the Minister agree that his government has fundamentally failed to take the necessary steps to keep people safe in their own homes? Today, and for months now, we've heard from members across the House about the nightmare situations faced by many leaseholders across the country. We have been left both physically, mentally and financially trapped in dangerous housing. Many of my own constituents have contacted me for support. They're worried sick of being trapped in unsafe housing, crippled with costs they did not incur and with no end in sight. One pensioner wrote to tell me he had just been sent a bill for £20,000. He's got no savings and no possibility of paying this bill. And 2 young NHS doctors want to sell up and take positions in hospitals in the North East, but they can't. They're trapped in a flat they can't sell and faced with the possibility of mountain debts due to flammable cladding that they did not install. And I asked the Minister how he sleeps at night, knowing that his government's move to cut red tape have left hundreds of thousands at risk in their own homes, and how he can justify asking leaseholders of these unsafe homes to foot the bill. Is it the responsibility of this government to identify the buildings covered in dangerous cladding and to make them safe before another disaster occurs, and to bring the companies who profited from cutting corners and compromising the safety of their residents to justice? Enough is enough, Mr Deputy Speaker. We are now at a crisis point, and instead of further delays and prevaricating, I call on members across the House to do the right thing today and back Lord's Amendments 2 and 4 so we can get a grip of this crisis before it's too late. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My first surgery I ever had as a Member of Parliament was about the issue of cladding. It was residents from St Francis Tower in Ipswich, and they were being chased for bills of thousands of pounds for unsafe cladding that they had nothing to do with. It was not their fault. And since then, since that first meeting, there has been case after case after case after case. It is a huge issue in Ipswich, a huge issue in my constituency, and it is destroying the lives of many of my constituents, and that is why I'm speaking here today, Mr Deputy Speaker. There has been a significant move forward since that first meeting. Since that first surgery appointment, we have moved forward. The £5 billion support has helped many of my constituents. The Waking Watch Fund, though I don't think it will be enough, is a step in the right direction. We are getting there. However, and the Building Safety Bill is itself 100% necessary and welcome. However, I'm still at a point right now where there are a significant number of my constituents who are leaseholders, often living in buildings over 18 metres, where there are significant issues to do with fire safety that will cost thousands of pounds to remedy, as the honourable friend for Dudley North has just touched upon. And this support, the support announced recently, doesn't cover them. So they continue to have this uncertainty hanging over them at not just in regular time, but during a pandemic, when more often than not, they have 1,000,001 other concerns and anxieties influencing their lives. So ultimately, it is why I believe that we have significantly moved forward. I'm very interested about the possibility for a building safety bill to pick up on this issue and make sure that those leaseholders who are living in those buildings where the buildings are unsafe, there are significant issues and significant costs that have to be paid, which are currently being placed on them, but this is not specifically about cladding. There are other issues and other factors that make these properties unsafe. So, as a member of Parliament for Ipswich, this is a huge issue. I do need to have assurances that the building safety bill will cover those constituents and it will give them that certainty. Because because I made a promise to my constituents when I met with them that I would leave no leaseholder behind. And I take my commitment as a Member of Parliament very seriously. And I promised to them, I looked them in the eye, and I said, I won't leave any of you behind. And sadly, there are still a significant number of those constituents who feel like they're left behind because they are. And it is a duty, I believe, to alleviate that. And it is for that reason that my name is on the amendment put forward by my honourable friend, a member for Southampton Itchen, and my honourable friend, a member for Stevenage. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much. Did link? Andy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The debate we're having today, worries from fire safety, has, I'm afraid, blighted far too many lives for far too long. That's why this is a particularly important bill. It's short and it has a very clear purpose. And we need to have this bill implemented as quickly as possible. Why? Well, it's 16 months since the first report from the Grenfell Tower inquiry was published, and we need to get a robust piece of legislation onto the statute books to deal with the fire safety issues identified. We owe it to that community to address these issues in a way that will not be open to legal challenge and which brings to a halt the toing and froing between this place and the other. That will delay the changes that are needed. Within this fire safety bill, we have rightly had the consultation on fire safety orders, and that now needs to be enacted. At the same time, we have the building safety bill. That needs to come to this House so that many of the issues which are understandably being debated today can be resolved in that legislation. This is about doing things in the right way so that they're not able to be challenged in the courts in the future. Now, I'm not taking away anything at all from the many leaseholders who bought their homes in good faith, trusting developers to build a safe home and purchasing with what they believed to be confidence that all had been done in accordance with the law. My Warrington South constituency doesn't have any buildings over the height of 18 metres which require remediation, and we aren't hit by the same issues as, say, cities such as Manchester or Liverpool. But I do have constituents with families and friends who are desperately worried, both about their loved ones' safety and for the costs of potential remediations, because they've used some of their savings to invest in a property to give them a future income. So I welcome the £5 billion already put forward by the government to begin to allow some of the issues to be addressed, with a commitment to fund all buildings over 18 metres high. I welcome the very clear indication today from the Minister that government will work with honourable members to address the many concerns being raised through the forthcoming Building Safety Bill. We must also recognise the daily worries and distresses among people who've been caught in this nightmare situation. Government now has an opportunity to show how funding promises will work in practice. In fact, this should be a ministerial priority. To conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I echo the words of my honourable friend, the member for Kensington. This bill is the first step, and we need to get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Biddy Link. Tim Farron.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I can't believe that the government thinks that this is the end of the matter, to follow on from the honourable gentleman who has just spoken, but I don't understand why they wouldn't commit now to meet the needs of all of those who are blighted through no fault of their own. This is a colossal injustice, and it is a very simple one to solve. The government just needs to make sure it is not those people who are the blameless ones bearing the burden. People bought their properties, their leasehold properties, in good faith. They are in the situation that they're in. Those properties are unsafe through no fault of their owners and entirely at the fault of the developers and of the regulatory framework and governments of various colours over the years that have permitted unsafe buildings to be built. How outrageous would it be if the blameless and the poorest are those who are left to pay the burden and pay the bill? The reality is that so many of those leaseholders in my constituency and elsewhere around the country are in no position to be able to move. They cannot sell. They are at their wit's end, and they are facing the end of their financial resources too. That the government says that they will fund the removal and the making safe of those buildings, part of blocks that are higher than 18 metres, that only actually relates to the cladding nature of those buildings. It doesn't cover other reasons that those buildings may be unsafe. What about wooden balconies or cement particle boards behind the cladding? That also needs to be covered. That those in buildings that are higher than 11 metres but less than 18, well, they will have to potentially take out colossal debt to be able to privately pay for the work that needs to be done to make their properties safe. And for those in owning flats in buildings that are smaller than 11 metres, they get no support whatsoever. I can tell you, Mr Deputy Speaker, but it's similar in your constituency also, that the vast majority, if not all, of the properties of this kind within constituencies like ours are much smaller than 11 metres. So this is a set of provisions that ignores particularly those in need in rural communities. There is a massive injustice here that we should be forcing people to be fretting and worrying, facing bankruptcy and all sorts of other challenges to their lives because of a burden that is not their fault, that they cannot afford, and the government is refusing to pay. As things stand, the government is going to meet the costs surrounding the removal and the making safe of cladding on properties that add up to only 13% of those affected and less than a third of the costs, and leave the massive majority of the burden on people who are blameless and the poorest. That is unjust, and that's why it needs amending.
Thank you, Tim. The last contribution in this bill is going to be Aaron Bell, and then we'll have the wind-up. Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale. And like many members, could I extend my best wishes to the member for Old Bexley and Sidcup? We all hope to see him back in his place as soon as possible. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate today. It's the first opportunity I've had to speak on this extremely important bill, and my thoughts naturally do turn to the unimaginable tragedy of Grenfell Tower. None of us will forget it. It shocked and horrified us all across the country. I know that this government is gripped by a determination to right the wrongs of the past and to bring about the biggest improvement to building safety in a generation to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. And while I'm speaking on Grenfell, could I just pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, and her speech earlier. She is right that we need to get on with it rather than be mucking about with parliamentary procedure. And that brings me to the reason why I'm supporting the government's positions today. The Queen's speech committed this government to bringing forward 2 bills on fire and building safety. The first bill is quite straightforward, but nevertheless an important step. And I very much await the second bill, the Building Safety Bill 2. We have to get things right in the right order, and we have to proceed as quickly as possible. So on the substance of this bill, I certainly welcome the policy intention. It's a profoundly important step towards remedying the flaws in the building safety regime that were identified in the Hackett report. It is a narrow bill, but it's one that enables legal certainty. And in the pre-legislative scrutiny of this bill on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, we had a lot of evidence suggesting that it was a compelling vision for the future of the industry. The Fire Action Safety Group called it a positive first step, and I recognise first step there. And the London Fire Brigade said it went a long way towards meeting the policy objective of a robust regime. And on this, I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, we can all agree. But in remediating the safety problem, there are other issues, and I'm sure I'm not alone in having had emails from a number of leaseholders worried about the unaffordable costs of remediation. They are uncertain, they're worried, and some face negative equity. And I agree with those who've said today that nobody should be put in this position. I can only imagine how I would have felt in my 20s or 30s receiving a letter suggesting I had a liability of tens of thousands of pounds. I don't minimise these concerns. However, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do take the government at face value when it says that the bill as drafted does not have the necessary legislative detail needed to underpin the amendments in the name of my honourable friends, the members for Stevenage and Southampton Itchen. My right honourable friend in his opening speech referred to this problem. Accepting these amendments would require extensive drafting of primary legislation to make these amendments legally workable. And this would significantly delay the implementation of the bill, and I'm very concerned about the consequences of that. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's clear that these high-rise buildings in this country should never have been fitted with this dangerous, unsafe cladding. It's vital we take the steps to make this right once and for all, making them safer, protecting residents from crippling costs, and at a pace that the severity of the situation demands. We must ensure that Grenfell can never, ever happen again.
Wind up, Kit Malthouse.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you. And thank you to the many members who've contributed to this, at times, impassioned debate about a matter which is of interest to all of us. I know that my fellow ministers at the Home Office and indeed at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government will be taking on board the many points that have been raised during the debate. And given the time that I have available to me, my apologies that I'm not able to address all the questions that have been put forward. I am, though, going to turn to some of the main themes that have dominated the debate, not least the remediation issue, where there has been such natural and understandable focus. It might be worth it, Mr Speaker, just to restate at the beginning what the broad task that lies ahead of us as a House and indeed a government is. It falls in three areas. First of all, we have to deal with remediation as quickly as possible. And we talked a lot about that today and how we can perhaps increase the pace. Obviously, there have been significant steps recently, not least the money that's been put forward. Secondly, we have to restore a proper appreciation of risk and value to those properties that are affected, so that the finance industry and insurance industry can do its work in enabling the transfer of those properties and their protection correctly, rather than the kind of current computer says no system, by all means.
I'm very, very grateful for him giving way. He mentions the time it's going to take, and whatever money you put forward, it will take 5 or 10 years to remediate many buildings. The insurance costs have quadrupled for many residents. There is a solution on the table that's been provided by ARMA, Residential Management Agent Association, where the government takes a top slice risk, and it will put those premiums back down to the level. Would he look at that proposal and see whether that might be something that can be put in place to ease the burden on many leaseholders today?
Minister.
Well, Secretary of State, Secretary of State, as Deputy Speaker, you never know. The Honourable Gentleman raises, as usual, a constructive point, and I know that the Secretary of State, MHCLG, and indeed the Chancellor are meeting with banks and in the insurance industry to see what solutions may come forward. And then the third strand of work is obviously to build a system of building safety and regulation for the future, which means that the terrible tragedy of Grenfell can never happen again. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to some of the questions that were asked. First of all, I was asked, not least by the Honourable Lady opposite, why we can't give a firm timetable for the building safety legislation programme. I recognise that there is an intent and desire for certainty, and we do want to legislate at the earliest possible opportunity. However, members should also be aware that making these fundamental reforms to building safety is incredibly complex. So it's important we get this right, as a number of members have raised, by ensuring that our measures are properly scrutinised by experts and Parliament before we legislate. The Building Safety Bill has over 140 clauses, and I can't prejudge the time Parliament will need to properly scrutinise this important piece of legislation before it's in the statute book. It's for this reason that I can't provide specific dates for when legislation will come into force. But I do want to emphasise again that the Government is committed, as ever, to deliver the inquiry's recommendations. We will bring forward the Fire Safety Bill into force. We will bring the Fire Safety Bill into force as early as possible after Royal Assent. The regulations will follow as early as practicable, and we expect the Building Safety Bill to be introduced after the Government has considered the recommendations from the HCLG Select Committee and when parliamentary time allows. So we are resisting the Labour amendment for the extensive reasons that I mentioned in my opening speech. We think it's unnecessary and it's inflexible, and I've restated the various points as to why we think that is the case earlier. Turning, Mr. Speaker, to the issue of remediation, in particular the amendments laid by my friend for Stevenage and indeed my good friend for Southampton Itchen. We do recognise that this is an issue that they care very deeply about, as do many members from across the House, and they've obviously worked very hard to represent their constituencies with dedication and with passion. Having sat with leaseholders myself in my role as Housing Minister and indeed with the bereaved and survivors of the Grenfell community, I am aware, of course we all are, of the terrible anguish and worry that this has caused to many. And we agree with the intent to give leaseholders the peace of mind and financial certainty they crave. The funding that the government has given to leaseholders is unprecedented. In total, we've supported them to the tune of £5 billion, and this is a very, very significant commitment indeed. It means that the government will pay for the removal of unsafe cladding if you are in a building over 18 metres. It means that if you live in a building 11 to 18 metres in height and you need to remove unsafe cladding, you won't ever have to pay more than £50 a month, and that is certainty and clarity that leaseholders have asked for and we have provided. And as my honourable member, as the honourable member for Thursley-Malton pointed out, this is a complex area where we are more than happy to continue conversations with the honourable members and indeed others as we move towards the Building Safety Bill. Now, a number of members, not least a member for Bolton West, North Somerset and Dudley North, raised the issue of height. And there was a focus on 18-metre buildings, and we've rightly focused on those above 18 metres with unsafe cladding for the most generous and comprehensive support package. The Department's position on this has been set out in a range of guidance, and the position has not changed or remains clear. We're taking a proportionate approach to fire safety based on long-standing expert advice. The importance of height alongside use as a risk factor is recognised around the globe. The number of people potentially exposed to the fire increases with the height of the building, and at greater heights, firefighting and rescue becomes more challenging. In this country, 18 metres is the height at which building standards become more restrictive and presumptions about firefighting tactics change. The advice from the expert panel recognises that the risk from cladding fires reduces for lower-rise buildings. And then finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, turning to the broad issue of where this sort of measure or this debate should happen, whether this is the right bill, which was raised by a number of members, not least the member for Dover, and in particular by the member for Kensington, who I know has been working extremely hard on this issue with some dedication, not surprisingly given that the Grenfell Tower lies in her constituency and in my former London Assembly constituency, and I pay tribute to the work she's done alongside that community to push the government and challenge us to do better and faster all the time. Now, both those members and indeed others made the point that this bill is not the correct vehicle for this matter to be addressed. And as I've said earlier, this is a short but critical bill to clarify that fire risk assessments are updated to take account of external walls and flat entrance doors. The Building Safety Bill is the appropriate legislative mechanism for addressing these issues, and it will be introduced in the spring. It will contain the detailed and complex legislation that is needed to address remediation costs. And it might be worth, Mr Speaker, just rehearsing, Mr Deputy Speaker, what will come in that bill. And just to outline the complexity of the bill itself, of course, it will produce a new national building safety regulator to enforce a more stringent regime for higher-risk buildings, to oversee safety and the standards of all buildings and enhance industry and regulatory competence. It's going to introduce clearer accountability for and stronger duties on those responsible for the safety of buildings in scope of the new, more stringent regulatory regime through design, construction and occupation. It will give residents a stronger voice in the system, ensuring their concerns are never ignored. It will create a stronger enforcement and sanctions regime to deter non-compliance with the new regime, along with regulatory resources to use sanctions effectively, and a new, stronger and clearer framework to provide national oversight of construction products to ensure all products meet high performance standards. And it will also introduce a requirement that developers of new build housing belong to a new homes ombudsman, and the removal of the need for social housing residents to pass through the democratic filter in order to access the housing Ombudsman. Now, you will recognise, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is an extremely complex piece of work, and for us to try and reproduce that in what is meant to be a short technical bill to kick off this process of work, we think would be an incorrect way to go. But our programme of work outside of this House is not limited just to legislation. As I said earlier, we've got a £5 billion investment in building safety, including the £3.5 billion announced on the 10th of February, which will fully fund the cost of replacing unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in buildings over 18 metres. We've obviously got the financing scheme for the removal of unsafe cladding for buildings of 11 to 18 metres, under which leaseholders will contribute no more than £50 a month. We've banned the use, as the Honourable Member for Hackney North said, banned the use of combustible materials in cladding systems on high-rise blocks, as well as hospitals, care premises and student accommodation. And we are establishing a fire protection board, chaired by the National Fire Chiefs Council, which is leading a programme of work supported by £10 million of government funding to ensure that all high-rise residential buildings in England are inspected or reviewed by the end of 2021. Now, it's for this reason, Mr Deputy Speaker, and for the various reasons that I outlined in my opening speech, that we do wish, as I say, to support Amendments 1 and 5 and resist those